What's going on, guys? This is VinylicPuma. It's been a few days since I uploaded a Borderlands 3 video, but today I figured I could discuss and give you guys some of my thoughts on the newly released Takedown at the Maliwan Blacksite update for this game. Now, as my title would suggest, I'm going to be talking about Mayhem 4 in this video, but before I get into the negatives of that, I do want to briefly talk about some of my thoughts on a lot of the positives that resulted from this particular update. And to start, we should discuss the newly added target dummy. To be honest with you guys, I'm pretty surprised and glad that Gearbox decided to add this to Borderlands 3. It's a really welcome addition, and while I guess I would have preferred having this thing at launch, it's better to get this thing late than to never get a dummy at all. There's also a bit of a welcome improvement here in the sense that unlike Borderlands 2, where you had to perform glitches to get behind the counter to test melee, you can now simply hop over the gap and melee the target dummy to test how melee damage works. The only things I could think of that would make this system better would be if there was some way to test your damage up against flesh, armor, and shields as a sort of toggle. And if there was a way to maybe freeze the dummy to test the full capabilities of your melee attacks and criticals, that would also be pretty beneficial. But in the end, it's great to see the target dummy return, and hopefully it will get more and more refined as time goes on. Another major positive with this update is the greatly enhanced bank size. Back in the Borderlands 2 days, I think the largest your bank could get was something like 30 or so, and to think that we would eventually get bank sizes in the 100s or 300s is pretty amazing. I also think it was really good of Gearbox to do this since Borderlands 3 has an insane amount of legendaries, and having a super high bank size like this will allow you to collect and hoard them all. The SDU costs are fairly high for each expansion, but the curve seems to be a lot lower than going from, say, 100 to 500 iridium in Borderlands 2. So overall, I would say between the bank expansions themselves and the lower SDU cost curve, it's a win-win. Speaking of win-wins, another one that's worth noting are the character rebalances. While it sort of sucks Amara didn't really have any changes, I suspect the improvements to Flak's pet damage will be beneficial, and I like how many of Zane's kill skills will now stack twice, which is pretty nice. However, I think the best part about this update is the improvements to Iron Bear, which seems a lot better than before. Probably the biggest benefit to Iron Bear is the new compatibility with Vampire, which actually makes Iron Bear viable in later stages of the game as it can now heal from the damage it deals. As a big fan of Moe's myself, I finally feel like I'm actually using Iron Bear now, and that's a fantastic improvement over what we had before. So the character rebalancing that has been done is yet another positive of this new update for the game. This brings us to the final benefit I'll be discussing, and that revolves around loot pools. Admittedly, I haven't explored all of the bosses yet, but from the limited farming that I've done, it appears that most bosses now drop a dedicated assortment of legendaries in addition to the random stuff that they dropped before. Granted, I feel like I've seen a lot of Thunderball Fists drop from multiple different bosses during my own tests, but there does seem to be stuff that drops consistently after enough farming attempts. And over the next couple of weeks, as the community figures out new loot pools, I think we'll all be pretty satisfied by the new drops. So again, the more dedicated loot pools for bosses is a welcome improvement and is something I'm glad to see. Now, the reason I went ahead and talked about all of these benefits before discussing Mayhem 4 and the takedown at the Maliwan Blacksite mission is to illustrate that there are a lot of good things about this new update. After all, many of these new additions were likely requested by the community, and it's always nice to see a game developer that's receptive to player feedback. And I suspect as Borderlands 3 continues to develop, Gearbox will continue to make improvements and alterations based on many of our suggestions. But now it's time to talk about Mayhem 4, and you guys may be somewhat surprised to hear me say this, but I don't think it's really that bad, and in some ways, I actually find it to be easier than Mayhem 3 was. Though before we get into that, we should probably talk about the most intimidating aspect of Mayhem 4 first, which is the crazy health, shield, and armor increases. Admittedly, these increases, whether it be roughly 9 times boosted health or 10 times boosted armor and shields, are pretty crazy. After all, Mayhem 3 only capped out at around a 1.5 times boost for health and maybe a 2 times boost for shields and armor. So to see such a steep increase here certainly makes taking down certain types of enemies noticeably harder, especially if they have all 3 of those health bars. That said, I think this most notably affects bosses who already have a high amount of health as is, and it appears the full 8.5 to 10 times multiplier on hit points ends up affecting them as well. For bosses that already weren't insanely difficult with the right builds, it's not really a huge issue, as it's just a matter of defeating them a little slower than you could before. But for some of the bosses that already had a lot of health, I do think it's definitely made them harder. After all, I'm using a version of the Dictator Assault Rifle here, which performs pretty well against Grave Ward on Mayhem 3, and in Mayhem 4, you can see that it takes noticeably longer to take this thing down. Beyond bosses though, I don't think the difficulty of most other enemies is drastically more difficult. Sure, it kinda sucks because these enemies do have more health, but with the right build on your character, I think you'll find that they're not insanely more challenging than they were before. And I think the reason for this mostly has to do with the less steep modifiers for Mayhem 4 when compared to Mayhem 3. And as an example, in Mayhem 3, it was totally possible for the player to encounter a situation where you could encounter something like this, where you had a number of debuffs to your weapon damage, enemies would take less damage from certain elements, while those same enemies also gained increased health, shields, and armor on top of all of that. Mayhem 4, on the other hand, doesn't really do this, and in fact, there are occasions where the modifiers you encounter don't really do much, if anything at all. Probably a great example of this is when it comes to this particular modifier here. While increased movement speed, fire rate, and reload speed will have some effect on your damage output, the bonus is only 16% and thus can usually be ignored. Additionally, the enemy-based modifier here, which boosts an enemy's weapon fire rate, will likely be something you don't even really notice all that much. Even in a semi-detrimental situation like this one, where the enemies take less damage from criticals, it's not a total disaster since you're not getting any other major debuffs. Ultimately, I think you'll agree the modifiers are less severe, and this ultimately ends up making Mayhem 4 a little bit easier in some ways. Rather than having to make sure you have a great fire, shock, corrosive, cryo, and radiation weapon on hand at all times, you could feasibly get away with maybe only having a good fire, shock, and corrosive weapon, and maybe go for a radiation weapon if you wanted. Something else to consider is that unlike Mayhem 3, where non-elemental weapons usually really suffer, they don't seem to suffer quite nearly as much in Mayhem 4 since there are a lot less debuffs overall. So in the end, and while there is more of a challenge with Mayhem 4 in some ways, I also think it's worth considering that there are other things that make it a whole lot easier than Mayhem 3 was. What I definitely do think is a little too hard though is the newly added Maliwan Blacksite area. Not necessarily because of Mayhem 4, which certainly does make things harder, but primarily because of what appears to be the automatic 4-player difficulty scaling of the enemies in Midnight's Cairn. This small aspect is the real killer for this entire update since it's not really geared towards the solo player at all. Granted, you can always turn the difficulty down to true Vault Hunter mode or one of the lower Mayhem levels and solo most of the area, but beyond that and into Mayhem 3 or Mayhem 4, you're going to have a very difficult time as a solo player. The enemies simply have a lot of health, and while there may be solo builds that are discovered in the future that can make this area soloable, we could encounter a situation where only one of the Vault Hunters is really able to pull it off. In a way, this mandatory 4-player difficulty kind of reminds me of the design for Destiny's raids, which usually require the player to have a group of friends that they solely play Destiny with. Granted, I suspect Borderlands 3 actually has matchmaking, which makes playing through the area more accessible, but as a solo player, I kind of feel left out. Maybe I'll end up discovering some insane new gear/build combo that makes soloing the area way easier, but for now, mandatory 4-player difficulty definitely makes this content harder to access and regulates you pretty much to standard True Vault Hunter mode, or maybe Mayhem 1 or 2. To be more positive though, I will say that it's nice to see a new raid boss. Wotan the Invincible is basically this giant tank robot, and while difficult for the aforementioned reasons, he is still pretty fun to take on. You're definitely going to want to bring some really powerful corrosive weapons, not just for Wotan itself, but the Valkyrie boss beforehand, which also is armor-based. Ultimately, and at the end of the day, guys, I've got to say that for the most part, I do like a lot of what was done with this particular update. After all, I do like Mayhem 4, and it does add a satisfying amount of challenge to the regular game. My only thing is that I wish Gearbox would remove that 4-player difficulty scaling from the Blacksite area. Letting it scale like the rest of the game, but maybe making the enemies here slightly harder than normal, would be the route to go in my humble opinion. Again, it's their game, they don't have to listen to me, but I just figured I'd give you guys some of my thoughts. Otherwise, guys, I think that's going to wrap up this particular video. If you enjoyed this video, definitely be sure to smash like, click the bell so you can be notified when I upload my next video, and as always, and again, thank you all so much for supporting this channel. Take care, and I'll see you all in the next one.